all of my colleagues, I get the pleasure of welcoming you to what ought to be a spectacular day. I want to start out by acknowledging Heather Dean, who has done a spectacular job, along with others, in organizing this event and corralling all of us in mid-July, end of July in the summer. Should be really a wonderful day. Jonathan Moreno pointed out to me that we've had other neuroscience and society, and even neuroscience and events and defense events here at AAAS and at other places in Washington, like the one with the statue, the Academy. But today's discussions seem to have a particularly interesting format. Where there'll be a lot of opportunities for discussion that I hope you'll take advantage of, and opportunities I would like to think of some new things that ought to be pursued and new kinds of questions that ought to be asked at this interface. So I am particularly pleased about this for multiple reasons. One, as a scientific dilettante, I think ethical issues are more important for the entire scientific community at this point in history, probably more important than any time in my own professional scientific lifetime. But I'm also a neuroscientist, and the nature of my own career has put me at the interface between neuroscience and society multiple times. Some of you may know I spent a term as the Deputy Director and Acting Director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and then as the Director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse before I came here. And I can tell you that the heavy influence of ideology, common sense, intuition about the way people approach those issues makes it extremely difficult and extremely important for science, for neuroscience in particular, not only to be thinking about the pathophysiology of those kinds of illnesses, but to be thinking about the societal implications of everything that we discover, and certainly many of the ethical issues that intersect with it. I also think it's important to recognize that we're living at a point in history, certainly in the history of American science, where I would say we have never experienced more tension between the scientific community and the rest of society, scientific community and policymakers in many times, in many places, and that's tremendously important for us in the scientific community, but I argue for society as well. The consequence, of course, a consequence is that public support for science is undermined. That's the narcissistic side of it from our perspective, but it also is the case that the tension that exists makes the receptors, the natural receptors for the product of scientific work, less ready to accept what science is showing, whether that's policymakers or the general public. And after all, in spite of the fact that many people believe that what we're doing, we do because it's interesting and provocative, the real purpose is the benefit of humankind. And if humankind isn't particularly interested, or worse, is anti-interested in what we're showing, the consequences are tremendous. It also is the case, as pointed out by the Japanese science minister, a couple of iterations of science minister ago, that for the first time in his experience, the public actually wants to have an influence on what science is done, but more importantly, on what science is not done. For the first time in his experience, and it's also in my experience, we find the public occasionally saying, please don't ask that question. And that seems extremely challenging to people like me. So what's the origin of the tension? Well, there are two categories from my point of view, those that are internal to science, those that are external to science. Let me just mention the internal ones very briefly. There are an array of things going on in science that are relatively rare events, but that can have tremendous consequences for all of science. Let me just give you, I have a list, but I won't read the whole thing. Instances of scientific misconduct, very rare events, but they have a very broad tarnishing effect on the image of science writ broadly. Human subjects, animal welfare, conflict of interest. You may recall NIH had an experience where 5 out of 5,000 intramural scientists were found to have committed very substantial conflict of interest violations, and the immediate response by the scientific community was, rare event, doesn't happen often, what are we upset about? The truth is the public was tremendously upset about it. Hyperbolic and exaggerated claims, etc. So there are things to which we in the scientific community, directly or indirectly, contribute that lead to the tension. But there also are this other sort of category where societal belief or societal understanding, long-held views, actually conflict with what science is showing and therefore produce tremendous tension. So the easiest one to think about are instances of widespread misunderstanding, like autism and vaccination. You may recall that the hysteria about vaccinating children came about because of one fraudulent study. Now, we didn't know it was fraudulent at the time, but one study meant that millions of children would not be vaccinated because their parents were afraid that they would become autistic. GMOs is another example in Europe. There's another category of, call them misunderstandings or misrepresentations, you choose, things that are politically or economically inconvenient, and I would put climate change into that category. That is, that why do people object or disclaim climate change? They take advantage of every instance of what appears to be scientific disagreement about the climate. They do it because it's extremely expensive and inconvenient to do something about climate and the causes of it, and therefore it's much easier to deny it. And then the one that tracks most closely to what I think we're talking about today is a set of issues where what science is showing conflicts with either people's individual beliefs or their religious or cultural values that they adhere to. So mental and addictive disorders are obvious ones, you know, depression, pull yourself up by your bootstrap, you're just a little bit sad, pull yourself together. Okay, science has taught us that's not true. I happen to have been involved in the decision to tell the world schizophrenia was a brain disease. People thought we were psychotic because everybody knew your mother had done it. How many of you were taught schizophrenogenic mothers and refrigerator parents? People frequently laugh when you make mention of it. Those of us of a certain age actually taught it to people in a university setting. And then there's the array that have conflict with core human values, and they span a whole range of categories where what science is showing makes for tension because of its intersection with the way people view or see the world or the way their religion sees it. So embryonic stem cell research is probably the easiest one for people to see. The conflict has to do with when you believe life begins. If you or your religion believes life begins at the moment of fertilization, embryonic stem cell research, bad. If your religion or you believe life begins later in gestation or the moment of birth, then it's not so bad, right? Because destroying an early embryo does not have the same implication. It's not a scientific question, it's a values, a belief question. Science has nothing to say about when life begins. Origins of the universe, synthetic biology, intelligent design, and evolution are all examples of it. And then there are an array of neuroscience questions that come about. So one of them, and there will be discussion of it today, and so I won't spend any time on it, are neurotechnologies for defense purposes and other purposes. Pharmacological enhancement of cognitive function poses all kinds of ethical questions. Neuroscience and the law poses legal and policy questions. And then I have a little list of others that are coming out of neuroscience, and you may think you heard it here, or if you've heard it before, you've heard it somewhere else. So the ability to predict behaviors. As behavioral science, behavioral neuroscience progresses, we will get better and better at not only explaining but predicting behavior. People aren't going to like that very much. How are we going to deal with it? Mind reading, understanding consciousness, the ability to enhance behavior, I said. And then in my own interest area, this whole question about where does your mind sit? So people like me have no trouble conceptualizing that in your case you don't have a separate mind and body. It's all a product of the little clickies and chemical events going on in that hard thing on your shoulders, and therefore, okay, your self is a product of the biological events going on in your head. What about mine? I have to confess, I have a little bit more trouble conceptualizing my own consciousness as simply a product of chemical and biological events per se. And then you get into the question of where do you keep your soul? So if your self and your mind is there, where is that thing that people believe to be a soul? So my point is mainly that there are an array of issues in neuroscience that have received relatively little attention, although there's a growing community called neuroethics of people interested in those domains. There are or will be policy issues that surround all of this stuff, because just like the other areas where science and society can come into conflict because of what science is showing, neuroscience presents a wide array of them, and that's really what we're here to talk about. What do you do about it? Well, everybody has their own answer. It usually is education, and I think education is necessary, but education will not be enough. The traditional approach of, just educate them poor, misguided, ununderstanding people will not work when it involves true conflict with people's beliefs and people's values. There's another approach called public engagement with science, where people actually meet in small groups with people who have different views and try to work out the differences and find areas of common ground, not the extremes, right? The evangelical fundamentalists are not moving on biblical literal creationism, but neither are the evangelical atheists on the other side. So you want the rational middle. Anyway, there are approaches to tackling the issues. I think understanding the issues is a critically important start, and that's what we're about today. So with that, let me repeat my welcome, say that I think this will be a terrific session today. I'm delighted so many people were able to take the time, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christian Macedonia, who is an entire empire, not simply a former Yugoslav republic. Dr. Macedonia.
Thank you. Okay, and I'd like to ask the panelists also to come up, because I'll be introducing them. Yeah, can you guys tell I'm a Mac user? Let's see, normal, reading view, slide master, slide handout. So any of you PC users, where am I supposed to go on this here?
PC users.
I'm looking across all of.
There's a little down at the bottom.
Oh, here we go, the little icon, there we go. Okay. Yeah, one of the reasons to have me moderating is because it's kind of like the hair club for men, you know? You got to have somebody who's actually got brain issues moderating. So anyway, I'm Chris Macedonia, and our family long ago gave up running the empire. I think it's a democracy in Europe now. We did have the panelists and I did have a little discussion about the introduction, and one thing is, because everybody's been provided with biographies in their materials, and just for the interest of orienting the people who might be watching the video later, I'll give very brief introductions to who our panelists are, most of whom are already well known to this group because they're people of eminence in the field. But I'll just give very brief introductions. I first should say something a little bit about myself. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist, which, you know, it's kind of interesting moderating a panel on neuroethics, and particularly neuroethics in defense. It sort of sets people on edge. But I think the selection of an obstetrician gynecologist to open something up like this is sort of like when you see the NFL player on Dancing with the Stars trying to dance the samba or something like that. There's sort of a morbid curiosity in how a 300-pound lineman dances. So anyway, I think there's a little morbid curiosity how an obstetrician gynecologist views neurotechnologies and ethics in defense. So just a few brief introductions about our esteemed panel. So Jim Giordano, he's at the Georgetown Pellegrino Center, and I see some people represented in the room from that. And he's also with the Potomac Institute, which is co-hosting this program. And also, in addition to that, he's a moderator today. So. And he also tells me he's a stockholder in the Hair Club for Men, but something happened.
I knew that was coming.
Oh, man. Tough love. So, and then I also want to introduce Bill Casebeer. He's a colleague of mine at DARPA, one of the senior thought leaders within the Department of Defense on neuroethics. I should also say that he is... It's almost like he's like Sisyphus within DARPA, because for those of you not familiar with DARPA, it's a sort of Men in Black agency that builds lots of gizmos, and here you've got somebody who's trying to turn this agency that's supposed to be about strategic surprise, preventing strategic surprise for the United States and bringing strategic surprise on the enemy, and everyone in the building normally thinks of developing a gizmo for that. And Bill is saying, the 21st century is about the brain, the mind, and conflict is not simply massive amounts of tanks somewhere on the plains of Europe. It's about something deeper. And so Bill is probably the smartest guy in DARPA, and I'm not saying that to be cute. And he's also probably the bravest, considering the task that he has. And then Andrew Herr. We have to have a fresh-faced biologist somewhere on the panel, so we got him. He's with the Center of for the New American Security, and I do want to mention that he's also some credit to him that he's a thought leader, particularly in kind of bringing the interagency together. So bringing disparate groups of people across the interagency to start thinking about things like human performance and neuroethics, not just within DoD, but even though he works as a contractor within DoD, but really thinking more broadly about how we bring the interagency together. And then finally, Jonathan Boyd, if the phrase, a person who needs no introduction were ever to be assigned to somebody, it would be Jonathan Moreno. I'm always impressed by people who have their own Wikipedia page, so you can look that up as well as looking in your materials. But he's, a person of great eminence within this field, has written extensively, over 500 peer-reviewed publications, books. He and senior advisor to the White House, particularly on not just on neuroethics, but ethics more broadly. So I said I was going to be brief. The next, I'm just going to, we're all going to limit our comments because we do want to have this to be a dynamic a discussion, not a group of lectures. So all I'm going to do in the next few slides is do nothing more than sort of frame the issue, not in terms of the scariest scenarios or the most vanilla of scenarios, but I'm just going to give you So, there are some people out there who kind of go, well, why would Department of Defense, why would they have any, scientific interest in the brain other than, to try to, destroy people or do other kinds of stuff? Well, the fact of the matter is that over the last decade, we've shoveled probably over $2 billion in Defense Healthline money against brain issues, and most of that pushed out to major universities, only about 10% to defense contractors or non-university agencies. So we're a significant funder of brain research. And so that top bullet, we do want to talk about contemporary issues related to defense that are part and parcel with injuries and illnesses. But we do also, Department of Defense is charged since a year before the birth of the country, 1775. Department of Defense has been charged with defeating the enemies of the United States and finding ways to do that, and doing so in a constitutionally consistent manner. And then we also have another issue that it gets discussed internally, but this is a beautiful forum to be able to discuss this, is how do we take brain function in healthy people and improve that? Some people might call that an enhancement, other people might call that Sudoku or crossword puzzles or learning guitar, I don't know. But there's a fine, there's a line somewhere, there's a red line that says that's really bad. That could potentially produce haves and have-nots. Where is that line? And so hopefully our panelists will get into that discussion. I just briefly, one of my jobs in the military, in addition to being an obstetrician gynecologist, was spending 4 wonderful years working for Admiral Mullen on helping bring the best medical care to our combat wounded. And so made multiple 6 trips into Afghanistan with a group called the Gray Team, where we tried to improve the care of our forces for both post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. And as I don't need to belabor the fact that a significant, some people would call the signature injuries of this war have been in the neuroscience domain. This is just a picture of some of the solutions, some of the technological solutions that were shipped out, because we are going to talk, hopefully Jim will get more into neurotechnologies, but many of the technologies that we shipped to Afghanistan, including MRI machines, including the blast gauges that were produced out of DARPA and so on, to mitigate blast and brain injuries, could have the potential to, in some other application be used for means that make people uncomfortable, or even some people would call nefarious. And then this is another topic that makes people nervous, but has been something that's been done by militaries for a long time, and that is fighting inside the enemy's mind. This is as old as Sun Tzu and the Art of War. But the fact of the matter is that deception is as old as the art of war, and that includes, and I have some things depicted on the slides, even more modern things that we've done to get inside the enemy's mind, to include things like dropping leaflets and using decoy or dummy vehicles to make the enemy think that we have more forces than we have. And I might also say that the birth of our country was contingent on a huge deception and a huge mind game that Washington played in Valley Forge, crossing the Delaware at Christmas, when he knew that everyone was going to be drunk and not fighting because civilized people didn't fight on Christmas Day. So there is a long history in the U.S. military of using deception in order to gain, including the birth of the nation. I should also state that, while we talk about pharmacology and neuro enhancements and other kinds of things, we should not forget that that's been something that's been long done by the U.S. military. In the Jackson administration, they actually put it into executive order that included in all military rations would be coffee, because they saw this as a enhancement rather than the rations before that. There was a mandate to put alcohol in all rations, and he had that order changed to coffee, to caffeine. So with that, I didn't mean to eat up too much time there, but I do want to allow our panelists, and let me just escape this and bring up our first presentation. And again, all of our panelists said we want to go ahead and make sure that the audience has plenty of time to interact with the panel and the panelists with each other. So, Jim, if I could ask you to step up, because your slide stuff is next. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for coming, and also a real big thanks to Heather, to Dorothy, and to Laurie for setting this whole thing up. A lot of work goes into these type of things. Another great thanks to the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. Obviously, I have some real parochial ties to the Institute and think it does wonderful work. Thank you for them for the wonderful webcast and putting all this together, and also for some of the works we've done at Georgetown University. If you enjoyed breakfast, that was on us. So let's begin with the premise, not the Hair Club for Men premise. We'll begin with a different premise. And the premise is quite simple, is that neuroscience and neurotechnology can and will, like any other form of science and technology that has come before, be uptaken into national security, intelligence, and defense agenda, very broadly, not necessarily wholly within the military operations, but also in certain venues that affect public life. So if we look, for example, at the brain, we can see that the brain represents a viably opportunistic target for these type of things. This is a locus that occurs on a variety of different levels. And the three letters that I'd like you to remember are AAT, assess, access, and target. And target with the real sense is what we look to do is find viable sites that may be useful for the use of neuroscientific techniques and technologies appropriately to certain mechanisms we understand how the brain works in health and disease, in various aspects of performance for cognition, emotions, and behaviors, not only in individuals, but also in groups and cohorts, and certainly writ somewhat larger on a populational level. So when we look at neuroscience and technology, colloquially referred to as neuro-S&T, we see that it has great capability, but also inherent limitations to be able to provide AAT, assessment, access, and targeting, that then allow some form of control, interaction, engagement with cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. Well, if we look at the idea of dealing with others so as to maintain some stance of intelligence, learning about them, security of those things that certain individuals, groups, populations, or nations hold dear, and also defense with regard to protecting the polis, we can see that neuroscience offers some interesting challenges and some, I think, viable opportunities. Without going too far down into the weeds, this is a general overview of the type of neuroscientific techniques and technologies that are generally possible into large-scale national security, intelligence, and defense agenda and use. We have the assessment technologies that include but are not limited to things such as neuroimaging, the use of neurogenomics and neurogenetics, neuroproteomics, and certainly neurocyber-informatics. Now, each and all of these could certainly represent a lecture unto its own, but I've only got about 7 minutes and change. Let's suffice it to say that all of these directions, as any one of the panelists here, and as many of you already know, have in fact been investigated for their viable potential. Each and all have certain capabilities. Each and all have definable limitations. One of the research agendas is to try to overcome those limitations or delimit them in certain ways through the use of conjoined approaches, not to use one alone, but to use them in a far more convergent way, in a process we call advanced integrative scientific convergence. But assessment and access certainly is insufficient. By virtue of what we've done as humans who are tool users, our very nature tends to compel us to not only use these tools to develop new theories, but then also to develop theories to develop new tools. This is a heuristic approach that engages the fact that we need to know so we can intervene, a technological imperative. And indeed, we also have a host of neuroscientific and technological interventions that are indeed capable of assessing, accessing, and then intervening at the brain. Cyber-linked neuromanipulation, for example, something that Dr. Casebeer will speak to at least in part. The use of novel pharmaceuticals, some rather successful and some still rather vague because we don't understand the completeness of their mechanism. The idea of utilizing neuromicrobiologicals, certain bugs. So we're looking at drugs, we're looking at bugs. We're looking at things like organic neurotoxins that characteristically are derived from a number of invertebrate species. So here we're looking at drugs, bugs, and slugs. And of course, we're also looking at things on a very small level, the possibility to utilize the nanoscalar approach, not only to gain unprecedented access into the brain space, but also to do so on a way that may be difficult to detect and also allow some operation on a very small scale that up to this point has not been allowable. But let's look at this to cash a reality check. There's a relative facility that goes along with neuroscience and neurotech. Unlike a nuke, unlike some other areas of large-scale science and technology, you can get a lot of this stuff off the shelf. Read the literature. It's cookbook. We also know that money of this has been done for basic purposes of health and medicine. But this too is a Janusian two-sided face. As we know, any of these can be employed in dual-use transferability. But there are also real dedicated efforts that look at weaponizable neuroscience and technology as means of dealing and contending with others. Now, there are a number of ways this can happen. Certainly one is the classic type of weapon, the bombs and bullets type of weapon. But there's also those types of weapons that change other individuals' will or dedication to fight. It change them to be far more ameliorative. I'll paraphrase Buddha and Abraham Lincoln. If I take my enemy and make them my friend, they are my enemy no longer. And these particular agenda are being enacted not only by nations, but independent actors who are then subsidized by a variety of different venture capital orientations throughout the world. So although we'd like to say that we believe and formally are committed to the fact the United States should always try to assume a moral high ground in its conduct of science and technology, we have to understand that there are a variety of applications, and the lack of commitment to neuroscience and neurotech here in the United States does not necessarily preclude other nations from engaging same. In fact, it may be an opportunistic window for them. So the question then is, how do we proceed? Let's start from the assumption that indeed this happens. How then should we approach the viability of an ethical address and perhaps guidance of neuroscience and technology in such agenda? Well, I want to give a deep nod to my colleague Curtis Bell. Curtis, some of you who may know, neuroscientist and philosopher, has really taken a very strong stance that neuroscience as a community should adapt a non-participatory posture by virtue of signatory treaties. I think in theory, the idea of separating science and technology from public use, from defense and security use, represents a noble undertaking. But in these days of shared information, open access journals, dual use, all of the issues I just spoke to you about, that may not necessarily be realistic. Noble, but not realistic. Instead, I think what it really takes is a 6P process, not to be precautionary, but more be prepared. This stuff will happen, and we need to be prepared for the fact that it happens. How? It takes people who are polydisciplinary, not only scientists, engineers, clinicians, but certainly ethicists, philosophers, lawyers, policy types like yourselves. They have to be perceptive, pragmatic, and persistent, really assessing what is there and probing deeper into developing certain types of models that are predictive of not only the possibility, but for the probability that there will indeed be benefits, but every benefit is accompanied by burdens, risks, and potential harms. And ultimately what we're looking to do is to get some form of prudence in the decisions we make that then ultimately inform guidelines and directions and be prudent in types of governance that we may need to engage, not only domestically, but internationally. I've advocated something called prudent parentalism. The idea there is that we recognize that some of this work may not need to be fully transparent or cannot be because it does have a very strong national security agenda and necessity. As a consequence, this too opens up a proverbial Pandora's box I'll be happy to discuss with you during the Q&A session. But I think one of the ways that we might be able to move towards this is what my colleague Diane Diulis has suggested, and that there may need to be some contribution and commitment of a national laboratory that has a real silo of particularly dedicated use, not only in terms of the science and technology, but also of the very strong ethics that are going to need to be tendered on a global level. Nothing happens without policy, ergo the importance of places like the Potomac Institute. What I've advocated, together with my colleague Roland Benedictor, is an approach we call history, a paradigmatic approach. That any attempt to try to gain a neuroethical orientation and neuroethical control and guidance of any form of neuroscience and technology, and particularly that which we might use for what we call specific silos of use, such as we might see in national security, requires an understanding of how this stuff might have been used before. To wit, I call the work of my colleague Jonathan Moreno, who presents a wonderful picture of the historicity of neuroscience and technology in national security and defense agenda through his two books, Mind Wars, in first and second edition, and through his ongoing work. So we have to understand the historicity, because historicity establishes canon. It allows us to take a deep look at what we've done with science and technology as tools and as tool users. What are the implications of the new science that sit on the cutting edge? What doors are being opened and what doors are being closed by that? We have to look at science itself, neuroscience, as a method that is not neutral. It is created by intent, and very often that intent is facilitated through use and development, but sometimes it is bastardized. What are those tools? What are their capabilities and real limitations? Let's not be ampliative and let's not be underestimatory. And from that, we develop a stance of ombudsmanship. What are the real problems? What are the real issues? Not science fiction, but science fact, as my colleague Rachel Wertzman and I are dedicating much of our current work to parsing what's real from what's not and dealing with the real problems. That's part of the responsibility. parsing that in a way that is pragmatic to move towards a stance of prepared prudence. And ultimately, these are the problems that must deal through some sense of yeomanship and yeomanry. The idea here is it's going to take groups of individuals to engage this guidance and governance in practice. And they may need to have great knowledge of not only how to talk the talk, but how to walk the walk. They need to be multidisciplinary. They need to be multifocal. This is a roadmap for how we believe this can be articulated. We begin with current issues of neuroethics, legal and social issues that are then definable. We model those trajectories. We identify particular approaches as they have been modeled with regard to not only particular points in these trajectories, but the halos for their multivalent effects within the realities of world cultures in which neuroscience and technology may be leveraged. Then we need working groups. And this creates this conjoinment of individuals who are multi-perspectival, who understand the nature, intricacies, and exigencies in which neuro-S&T can and likely will be used. This helps us to develop the stance of preparedness in process, and we get some point of resolutions, ethical guidelines, policies, and perhaps laws. These are then focused back onto those extant NELSI issues, and obviously this also allows us to move forward to develop new neuroscience and neurotechnology under these policies that support, either financially and or through policy and guidance, new developments for research and translation. These then initiate a whole new set of neuroethical issues. This is the program that we advocate. This is our stance, and my hope is that I offer this to you tentatively. It has to be a work in progress. This is, in fact, rather contentious and provocative work, but we understand that any form of reality check must pragmatically assess that there's a need to do this, not at some distant future, but today. How we do it, assuming the moral high ground and doing it in ways that are not only technically right, but morally good, takes the conjoinment of individuals, just as we have in this room. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, Bill, you're up.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much, Chris, for the kind introduction. If I can do 10% of the service to your rhetoric, I will consider my mission here to have been fulfilled. Thanks very much to Heather and her team at the AAAS for putting this conference together, and to the Potomac Institute for co-sponsoring it. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today talking about issues in neuroethics and national security. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, given my background with a foot in both the operational military world and in the neuroscience research world. So I think as we think about the issues that surround the application of neuroscience technology, especially the moral issues, that we need to consider several groups of stakeholders, people who will be influenced by how we apply the findings of neuroscience in the national security domain. So here are three of them on my only slide. On the left-hand side, you can see a Tuareg tribesman living in eastern Mali. I took this photograph just east of Timbuktu when I was doing field work there in the early 2000s, exploring what impact the stories and narratives that violent non-state organizations in the area were having on things like recruitment rates into potential terrorist organizations. And this young gentleman probably has a decision he has to make. Let's say he has a long-standing, perhaps entirely justified grievance with the government of Mali regarding distribution of resources. He has to decide whether or not he's going to resolve that issue via nonviolent means, and perhaps join an organization like the Alliance for Democratic Change, which wants peaceful change to address some of the resource distribution issues in Mali. Or he could instead choose to ally himself with something like a group that used to be known as the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, the GSPC, a radical organization operating in the area, and which has since changed its name to Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb. So this gentleman, I would argue, has a mind-brain that may very well be exploited by people who have intimate cultural knowledge of how stories and narratives might influence his attitude about how you redress grievances. And it could be that neuroscience might offer us a key for helping us build technologies and approaches that could provide a bulwark for cognitive liberty to prevent individuals like this from being exploited by those who don't have their interests in mind. So, in other words, bystanders to conflict are one group of stakeholders in the neuroethics and national security debate. A second group of stakeholders is seen in the middle. These are the actual parties to conflict, not just potential parties, but actual parties, such as this Ohio State Guardsman, who, when he deploys downrange to somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan, will want to be able to resolve a disagreement quickly and without the use of force, if at all possible. But when the use of force becomes morally sanctioned, in fact, probably morally required in some circumstances, as just war theory would say, then he will have to bear the scars of the application of force when he or she returns back home. And the wounds of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury plague us still. So how we apply national security in the battlefield might give him or her both new capabilities to exercise so that people aren't harmed as much in war, and it might give us new prophylactic or therapeutic regimens to redress the wounds that are caused by war. Finally, on the right-hand side, you have a third set of stakeholders, future generations. All right, so this is a young baby who, as it turns out, has a condition called MAOA mutancy. What that means is that this child is unable to produce a enzyme that is responsible for catalyzing or eating serotonin in the brain. And as a result of that serotonin dysfunction, this child, when raised in the right developmental circumstances that include things like perhaps abuse in the home during critical breakpoints in development, might have trouble regulating violent impulses, which is why, controversially, but nonetheless provocatively, a lot of the male prison population in California are MAOA mutants. So this set of genes that codes for that enzyme is at the tail end of the Y chromosome, and it's likely to be lost in crossover, so males are far more likely to have this mutation. So this person, a member of a future generation where violence might be brought to bear on the battlefield, will be influenced by whether or not we understand the precursors of violence at the neurobiological level and whether or not we can develop clinical regimens that address them. So if we're going to address the needs of these stakeholders, the moral needs of these stakeholders, the needs they have by dint of being sapient creatures, agents who use reason, and sentient creatures, agents who have nerve endings and whose happiness ought to be considered in overall happiness, if we're going to take these concerns seriously, I would argue we need to apply some of the traditional tools of ethical analysis that have been developed over the last several thousand years of human conflict. So here's the lay of my talk. For the next 5 minutes or so. I'll keep this relatively short. I will talk with you for about a minute about some of the issues in neuroscience that are raised by considering violent non-state actors in the battlefield. I will then give you a 1-minute overview of the traditional tools that military ethicists have used to think about regulating the application of violence, namely use ad bellum and use in bello considerations, the just war theory. Then I will spend a couple of minutes talking about how those tenets are themselves informed and justified by the big three ethical theories that you get, especially out of the Western ethical tradition of Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and Mill. So I'm going to offer up, if there's only one thing that kind of sticks out of this talk, a 3 C's framework for the evaluation of the development and application of national security neuroscience technology. Those 3 C's are considerations of character, considerations of consent, and considerations of consequence. Then I'll conclude with some parting remarks about how I think applying that framework to neuroscience actually licenses us to do some very interesting research in this domain that, if done well and with due attention to the context of conflict, where we are oftentimes in an adversarial circumstance, can best serve the moral interests of all 3 of these stakeholder groups. All right, let's turn to the first area. Violent non-state organizations. What does that have to do with neuroscience? If you look at something like one of the preeminent threats we face in the DoD today, the rise of terrorist organizations, violent social movements, etc., something like an open systems theory is a valuable framework to use for thinking about how these organizations stand up, grow, mature, and transform. So this looks at the environment in which violent action takes place, looks at the precursors and conditions that lead to certain types of violent resistance, and looks at the transformational features that might cause a group such as the Palestinian Liberation Organization to transform into something like the Palestinian National Authority. So if you look at that open systems theory and the causal relations between all the moving parts of that system that produces something like AQIN, that Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb, you find a lot of places where neuroscience technology could either shed light on causal forces at work or provide insight into how we might be able to disrupt that system. So that ranges from issues of recruitment, persuasion, background factors such as resource deprivation, scarcity, human migration brought on by resource pressures, etc. And the transformational processes that might cause an individual to choose to use violence to resolve their disputes rather than a more transparent and deliberative democratic process include things like what kind of stories and narratives that individuals told, whether or not it's within the horizon of possibility for them to think of using violence to redress their grievance, in-group, out-group distinctions that often motivate conflict between groups, all of which have a neurobiological dimension which can be explored. So I would argue, even if we just confine our remarks to something like terrorism and violent non-state organizations and how they grow and how they can be combated, dealt with, that there are lots of scientific issues that are useful to think about. Now you might say, fine, great, but we're at sea in a sieve. We have no principles we can use to help us think about these issues systematically, intelligently. So now my next pivot. Let's talk about the tools that we have used in the past when talking about more traditional tools in the battlefield, right? Guns, bombs, bullets, etc. We have a several hundred-year tradition that grew primarily out of Catholic philosophers that is captured in the tenets of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. So those are just Latin terms that mean justice before the conflict and justice during conflict. So before the conflict, there have been 7 general questions. You shouldn't think of this as a checklist, but 7 general questions that thoughtful individuals have grappled with before they've decided whether or not it's justified to apply violence to resolve a political dispute inside of this thing called just war theory. Those range from, is the violence sanctioned by a legitimate authority, a democratic polity that licensed the use of force in a transparent process, on to consequential considerations. Does the application of violence, will it actually produce a world that is better off in the long run than if, say, we didn't intervene to prevent a genocide, for instance? So those 7 questions, which I don't have time to talk about, which you can grab Wikipedia and explore, I think might be useful questions to structure our thinking about neuroscience in the battlefield as well. Or consider jus in bello considerations. So that's the application of force inside of the context of war. Here we have 2 general questions we've asked. They include proportionality of the application of the technology. Right? So am I going to, again, produce more benefits vis-a-vis ending the war more quickly than not by using the technology? And am I applying the technology discriminately? And on the battlefield, that normally means, is it being used against combatants? So part of why these questions are useful to ask in the domain of the application of violence is that they are themselves informed by bigger picture moral theories that, that we all have access to by dint of the intellectual heritage that really started with Aristotle and Plato in Greece and other theorists like Confucius in China in the East. So the way those moral theories are normally captured inside of an ethics course that you might have had in your undergraduate years, and I apologize if I'm causing some latent PTSD by forcing you to drudge up memories of a philosophy course. But those 3 theories are normally thought of as being character-oriented or virtue-theoretic. What kind of traits ought we to develop as individuals to help us flourish? Those traits that help us flourish are called virtues. Those that make us dysfunctional as human beings are called vices. Or they are captured by the thoughts of Immanuel Kant, the Prussian deontologist, who talked about rights and duties that obtain by dint of us being free and reasonable creatures. So a Kantian deontological or rights-oriented framework. And then finally, the good old-fashioned consequentialism of people like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, who said that our moral yardstick ought to focus on the production of good consequences. So those are the 3 major camps of extant moral theory. And as I gave you a 1-minute summary of those, you probably saw connections between them and the questions we asked in jus ad bellum and jus in bello vis-a-vis the application of violence in the battlefield. So I would argue that a good starting point for us is to apply those 3 frameworks to neuroscience-oriented technologies and ask, Does their application in a context of actual or potential violence help us flourish as human beings? Does it take into account the rights and duties we owe to all the stakeholders in the conflict? And does its application produce good consequences on balance? So those are the 3 C's I mentioned at the start: character, consent, and consequence, an analog to the 4 or 5 C's that you might get when you grade a diamond if you're looking to buy one of those. So when I apply those 3 C's, now my final pivot before my parting thoughts, to neuroscience technologies, one interesting thing I think stands out. On the left-hand side, if you will, there are the more probable consequences of the application of neuroscience technologies in the battlefield along all 3 of those dimensions. So consider, for example, the character-based side of the equation. You can look at something like the augmentation work of Kevin Warwick, a researcher in the UK who in the late 90s and early aughts was famously shown on the cover of Wired magazine, one of the first individuals to augment his organic reality with machines that would do things like automatically open the doors of his house and so on. So you can certainly ask, is the augmentation of human capability and capacity in that fashion conducive to human flourishing, right? And you may have some entirely justified concerns there. Now, on the other hand, if you push to the right-hand side of the spectrum, wholesale replacement of the brain with computing devices and so on, you quickly get to something that looks like a Warwickian disaster, right? Where suddenly we have no purchase upon what it even means to be a human being and to live the form of life that we do any longer. All I would point out is that we haven't reached a point of Warwickian disaster, and that most of our applications of neuroscience technologies in this domain are used for the military to tutor and enhance operational performance, allow you to, say, process a satellite image more quickly using this well-developed computer you have on top of your head, or to address clinical conditions, right? So talk to someone who has cochlear implants or who has problems with the retina that can be addressed with the right kind of equipment. So those kinds of applications, I would argue, are far more likely, and so long as that research is taken with the requisite IRB-style considerations of beneficence and consequence in mind, I think that we're cleared warm on the character front. What about consent? Well, we can, of course, again, take a left-hand side and right-hand side view. On the left-hand side, it might very well be that some technologies, when applied, have an underside that makes us question whether or not traditional distinctions between combatancy and non-combatancy can be maintained. Right? So we need to have our eyes wide open when we think about those technologies. But at the far end of the spectrum, you instead have things like a Burgessian disaster, right? So many of you have probably read Burgess's book, A Clockwork Orange, or saw the Kubrick movie upon which it's based, where people who are subject to certain kinds of neural interventions, their dignity as human beings is not taken into account, and that's probably a world where we would not want to live. So again, we need to take consent seriously. I'd argue that a lot of our worst disasters, if you will, that we visualize in this domain are fictional. Finally, also look at considerations of consequence. On the one hand, neuroscience technologies will help us do things like deal with trauma in the aftermath of a battle, provide prophylaxis to combatants on the battlefield potentially, mitigate the likelihood that non-combatants will be exposed to neural trauma. So that's all on the highly likely end of the spectrum. And now if you move to the right, you can look at something like speculation about how a nanoscience-oriented neurotechnology might go out of control and produce 8 feet of gray goo that blankets the surface of the earth and cause the extinction of the human species. Horrific consequence, yes? Highly unlikely. Even somebody like K. Eric Drexler, one of the leading lights in the early days of nanotechnology, would say. So I would argue that on the application side, as long as we pay due care to character, consent, and consequence, that we are at least cleared warm to cautiously proceed with research and application of neuroscience technologies in the battlefield. And in fact, my parting thoughts now, I actually think it's morally required of us, especially individuals in the military who have a fiducial and moral duty to defend those whom they are charged to defend and to protect the universal and objective human rights embodied in documents like the Constitution. Keep in mind that in an adversarial context, restraint, especially undue restraint, imposes risks. It imposes the risk of exploitation by those who don't take these moral constraints seriously. And it points out that things like the precautionary principle, where we don't invest in a particular area of research merely because it has some potential but highly unlikely bad consequence, may not itself be justified when it comes to the application of neuroscience technology. So, in conclusion, I would argue that these three stakeholders have a lot at stake in the debate about neuroethics and national security, and that it may actually be morally required of us to take those interests seriously, and that if we do so, the character and consent consequence framework will tell us about how we can, in a morally praiseworthy fashion, apply research in neuroscience to the battlefield. Thank you.
I know that Andrew's going to get us back on track here.
I promise, as both the junior member in age and accomplishment, I should be able to keep it short and sweet. So we've heard a couple really wonderful talks, I think, that took a very top-down and a framework approach that provided ethical guidance for what we can and can't do. I'm going to take a slightly less cognitively complex approach and come bottom up. And one of the prompt today to some of us was, what are the issues in neuroethics today? And so I'm going to talk about some issues in defense that we see today, and then move a little bit further down the road with each of the four issues I'll talk about in terms of both as we move forward in S&T development and also temporarily. So I try to put pictures on the cover. These are each of the slides to make sure that I don't have too many and that there are pictures on each one. So why are we here today? I would propose that we're here today because we believe that neuroscience is going to progress in the future. What we have today is quite powerful, but if we believe it's going to progress in the future, it's more and more powerful, and that's a very scary and also opportune issue. So I'll quote William Gibson and Arthur C. Clarke to say that the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed, and to say that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And when you synthesize those two quotes, I take it to mean that there are magicians here today already, and that there will be magicians in the future, and some of them may use neuroscience. And so that's I think, for me, a background context to what we're talking about. So this is the Ray Osterreich complex figure. It's a cognitive psychology test. And when you take somebody who's not been under high stress and you show it to them, and then you take it away for 60 seconds and ask them to copy it, on the top they do quite a good job. And on the bottom, somebody who's been under tremendous levels of stress does a very poor job. So as we all sort of know, stress degrades our thinking and our working memory in this part. But I think much more interestingly, here people are copying it with it right in front of them. And they switch colors in the middle of it. And on top, the person gets a green pen first. And you see they do the outline, and then in the second half, they fill in the details. But on the bottom, somebody who's been under high levels of stress goes left to right. So it's a much more linear approach. So I think it's really interesting to think that we now understand that stress not only degrades the quality of our thought, but how we think. And this ties directly into our development and understanding, but also some issues we're dealing with in the military today, particularly in the PTSD area. We know that stress doesn't affect everyone the same way. We know that people in the same units come back without any PTSD and with very serious symptoms. And we now know from some research that even on a physiological level, that there is a strong correlation between some things that may be precursors of PTSD, like dissociation, and your body's levels of certain hormones. So now we know that there's inter-individual differences. And then when we look at data from the Naval Health Research Center out in San Diego, demonstrates that actually from their surveys, that deployment-related stressors, so these are being separated from the family all the way through the difficulties and unpleasantries of living in Afghanistan, or actually have a higher odds ratio for development of PTSD than high exposure to combat. So this suggests that in the future, we both may be able to predict who is more likely to have psychological injury, pardon me, and then also there are ways we could modify it. And this is, I think, a neuroethics issue, because one of the great questions that we have to answer is a physical injury to your arm or neck the same thing as an injury to your brain, especially one that in all the descriptions of PTSD, people suggest there are changes in personality, which may be much more central to changes in who we are. And how do we approach those issues when we know some people are more liable to it, but then you send other people to war and not those first people who then themselves are at risk of injury? So what is the ethical approach there? The second issue is moving forward to selection using neuroscience-based tests. We know in the first, or the second slide I showed, that certain reactions to stress are correlated with physiological metrics. And as I mentioned, dissociation is one of those. But we also know that dissociation is negatively correlated with objective military performance in special operations selection schools. So with that understanding, we now have an opportunity to potentially use a physiological metric for selection, and one that's related to cognitive and psychological functioning. And this has tremendous implications in a society that's founded on the phrase that we would now interpret as all people are created equal. And yet we know they're different. That doesn't mean better or worse, we just know that everybody's different. And so how do we approach this when you may be able to save resources, find more people who can make it through selection, but when by doing that, you're going to almost certainly exclude some people from the opportunity to try who could make it through based on the way their brains operate. Moving on to enhancement as we move forward, although obviously we do enhancement today, both through school and we use drugs like modafinil. So here we see research from the Air Force Research Lab in which transcranial direct current stimulation produced abolishment of the degradation and vigilance we normally see in stressful and not even stressful, just high focus events. But I think it's key to acknowledge that, strangely enough, both anodal, sending a current into the brain, and cathodal stimulation, pulling the current out of the brain, both had a beneficial effect, which was not what people expected and very interesting. So we can do some things today that we think will enhance, especially in the laboratory, but we don't always understand why. But presumably going forward, if we believe this field's going to advance, then we're going to understand why better in the future. And some of these things are going to have cognitive effects, undoubtedly. So why do I care about cognitive effects? I would propose that war has always relied on the cognitive as much as the physical, but going forward, this will only be a stronger ratio. Here is data from Vietnam. From 1967 to 1969, the US Air Force and the US Navy, fighter pilots both had a 2-to-1 exchange ratio against the North Vietnamese Air Force. That means they killed 2 fighters for each one of ours that was lost. These numbers were unacceptable to both services, so the Air Force went back and said our missiles aren't working right. The Navy went back, said our missiles aren't working right, but halfway through that study said, actually, we think it's a training issue. This is the genesis of Top Gun. People go through this training, the Air Force tries to fix the missiles, and from 1970 to 1973, the Air Force maintains only their 2-to-1 exchange ratio, and the Navy goes to 12.5-to-1. So a training program gives you almost an order of magnitude improvement in combat performance. And I would suggest that even with continued advancements in technology, in the aviation and every other world we work in the Department of Defense, that the cognitive aspect is tremendously important and will only become more important. So enhancement matters, and we often think of it as a top-down approach, which is, will the military do research on enhancement and then deploy it? But we also have to think from the opposite, which is, will society introduce enhancement, and then we will recruit from a pool of people who choose to enhance themselves? And I think we know that both will be probably important factors, but I suggest actually that the societal factor may be much stronger. There's already a tremendous demand in Silicon Valley, in universities and other places to enhance people's cognition. And moving forward, those technologies will likely become more powerful and more accessible. As I said, the private sector for interest in enhancement is big in terms of B as in billions, but also in interest. And so from entrepreneurs to do it yourself, and I note that in 2008, a major drug company was fined almost $500 million partly for marketing off-label drugs. But within the military, there's interest in enhancement too. If you look at the chart on the bottom, you can see that this study is a couple of years old, but in surveys of Army personnel, more than half of Army personnel take supplements weekly. And I think quite interestingly, the number of people who take more than 5 supplements a week is larger than the number who take 2 to 4 supplements a week. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of things. And so we also have then the obligation to think, if some of what they're doing has not necessarily been tested or supported by science, do we have an obligation to help test things to see if they're safe or whether people are hurting themselves? So the bottom-up thing creates a number of problems for us, in addition to the critical issues of making sure we protect our military personnel. Obviously, they serve in a coercive environment because you have to do what your commander says. So if somebody's given the opportunity to take part in a trial and their commander says, I think this is a good idea, is that an order, or do they still have the ability to consent? And these are critical issues that I think we really do think about in the military, and will continue to be crucial for going forward. The last point on this is that animals are not the same as humans, and humans in a laboratory are not the same as humans on the battlefield. And so perhaps the fundamental challenge here is no matter what happens in society, and no matter what we learn in neuroscience in the lab, we have a challenge to think about how much translation we can do. And if we really do believe that enhancement is important, and it may be important from the standpoint of ethically important, as Bill said, I think quite nicely, we may be ethically required to do certain things. So I always think there's a juxtaposition of we need to make sure we protect our military personnel from any research that could harm them. But on the other hand, if there's research that could help them, it may mean that going into combat, they're less likely to be injured or killed. And so we have to balance these issues going forward. To the point of whether or not research is applicable, there's a wonderful study multi-center study out of Harvard and MIT, which showed that basically the similarity in the genomic response between mice and humans for major trauma and burn was about 10%. So in that respect, that animal data on trauma and burns is basically unusable for humans in some parts of the research. And then if you see the stress levels at the bottom, baseline, skydive, SEER school, which is survive, evade, resist, and escape, which is a special school given to people who might fall into enemy captivity. We see not only that the stress levels are fairly categorically different, but it's also important to recognize that your skydive lasts perhaps 30 seconds or a few minutes, and SEER school or captivity can last for weeks or months. So final thought, moving it all the way to the right in terms of development and timescale. If we could end up with an effective commercial brain-machine interface that can read our brain, this would be tremendously economically important and more than likely would be a requirement if it were legal in society to operate at the highest end of the economic structure. And yet, there are people in this room who've had access to classified information and therefore who, right now as the rules are written, could not connect their brain to a computer. And as a result, I always talk about this as a recruiting challenge, because who would want to join the government and work with classified information if it meant you could never have the opportunity to go work for Google or go work for whatever companies are important in the future? But it's also an ethical issue because people who signed up to work for the government today never signed up for that in the future, and yet the government might ask them in the future to never do this. So there are certain crucial intersections there of the development of neuroscience technology and ethics as we think about not only national security, but individual liberty, freedom, and opportunity, which I think are core to our country. So I hope that's been close to on time. I thank you for everyone for coming today, and hopefully we'll have a great discussion later. Thank you.
They have these numbered, so it should be number 5. Let me go up here. Should be right there. Yep.
Good morning. Thank you also to the organizers and particularly Heather, who accepted some last-minute slides from me about 36 hours ago. I am not actually going to be talking about mind wars because I figured that these smart guys to my left would already have talked about some of the ideas and technologies I talk about in the book. Instead, I want to behave more like an historian and interdisciplinarian this morning and talk about some things that have been kicking around in the space that Alan Leshner thinks he has but that I don't have, namely the mind. And I want to tie in some of our conversation to some things that have been going on in the world outside the seminar room in the last few weeks. But again, because I figured that these colleagues of mine were going to be talking about some of the ideas that I've been interested in for the last few years, I've decided to move in a somewhat different direction. I also want to point out, as Alan mentioned, that we have been here before. This is my younger and handsomer version. My avatar, actually, it wasn't me, I wasn't here. And we had an interesting conversation in this room about, 5.5, 6 years ago on some of the same problems. But I want to do something, as they used to say in an old sketch comedy group, a little different, something completely different. No, not completely perhaps, but just to point out that we've had this very interesting conversation about the implications of the information that Mr. Snowden appears to be sharing with at least somebody, perhaps with President Putin, or Prime Minister Putin. I can never keep track of what he is, who now, of course, is a kind of a problem for him. I've been in that airport, by the way, and I don't highly recommend hanging around too long. So what can we make of this with respect to the question of privacy? And I'd like to, again, offer some thoughts that are rather new for me and that are connected, I think, to the current debate about privacy, raise some neuroethical and political policy questions for us, for our country, and for the rest of the world. So the idea of privacy is actually an idea that the Greeks and Romans didn't worry about too much. There are occasional allusions to privacy in Plato's writings, but for the most part, you don't see a lot of focus on privacy until somewhere around the Enlightenment. The Panopticon was mentioned. So people start thinking about themselves in the Enlightenment as unique individuals with dignity, partly because they have privacy. It always fascinated me that this is even reflected in architecture. If you go to Versailles, to go from room to room, you don't walk down a hallway, you walk from room to room. And whatever's going on in that room is what you have to observe, or you may have no choice but to observe to get to the next room. So even our architecture started to recognize, post-Enlightenment, the idea that to be an individual with something that we call dignity, whatever that is, has to do with privacy. So we value privacy. I'm somebody who often has said, as many of you have probably said, I don't care what they learn about me, about my behavior online or walking down the street. I live a boring life. I've been married to the same person for 33 years. I have nothing to hide. But I think that's the wrong answer. If I'm right about the way that we as post-Enlightenment people think of ourselves, privacy is important. And it's important whether we think we have anything to hide or not. But I know that you guys have a lot to hide, so I know you have much more reason than I do to worry about it. And of course, in the context of neuroscience, we're especially worried about privacy now. The President's Brain Initiative, I actually meant to put in a little image from the European Brain Project, which is, they're actually much more audacious than we are. We're probably going to start with zebrafish, as I understand it. They're actually going to do the human brain, but they have a lot more money to spend on it too, apparently. I don't know how, because Europe's going broke, but they're spending a lot more money on the brain than we are. This is, of course, some of you know Jack Gallant's amazing work, where he's reconstructing or constructing images, basically movies, about what you're looking at. And then we have some really interesting work also being done at Berkeley. I don't know what the hell is going on out there at Berkeley these days, in which they're putting electrodes into people who have open skull surgery, and they're saying a word to them. Some of you have heard this audio file, it's on the web. And they're reconstructing a couple of different algorithms, just knowing what cells are firing the word that they're hearing. So, this is pretty fascinating stuff, and it does raise all the usual questions that people in this room are interested in about privacy and mind reading and so forth. And of course, the image that we have, images that we've gotten from the great writers of the past, like Wells, is somebody is watching you, or George Orwell, his idea of the view screen is pretty primitive. If Smith could actually turn his back to the view screen and sort of more or less, he thought, hide what he was doing. That is so 1948, not 1984. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that as a practical matter, I don't buy it. I don't think that a lot of us are going to get into Jack Gallant's big fMRI, that big magnet, and I especially don't think that a lot of the guys who are being kept perhaps inappropriately, unjustifiably at Guantanamo are going to get in either and be very cooperative subjects for functional MRI. I don't think we're going to be putting them in airports and be reading minds or looking at brains, although I am in touch with lots of people who believe that we are doing this right now and have been doing it for a while. I don't think so. And the truth is that there are other more interesting challenges to privacy that have been going on in other areas that will, I think, ultimately join with the neuroscience questions. And so I'm going to make a little segue here to the idea of networks. I actually think that the concept of a network is one of the great ideas of the last 100 years that has been under-recognized. And it's amazing to me that there aren't more philosophers and historians of science who are working on the idea of the significance of the idea of a network. I think this is a very important idea. So for example, this is a network. This is a network that I just got by Googling, which is of course itself a network. Here's another network. Sorry guys, you have to turn around. I know it's hell. For those of you who missed it, this is a network, and this is a network. And so the question is, which is the neural network and which is the social network? Now, I know people in this room have been looking at neural networks for a while, so you know the way we usually represent them. Nonetheless, I think this is quite interesting. And the next question I have is this an action of representation? In other words, this is just a simple way of representing objects that are, or data points, as we say these days, that are linked to each other in some way. It's partly that, but it's not just, it's certainly not just an action of representation. So we have known since my hero William James published The Principles of Psychology in 1890, this concept of neuroplasticity, as he says in the Principles, our nervous systems have grown in the direction in which they have been exercised, and indeed, the way that your nervous system grows and the links that are made, the physical links that are made, and he understood this 123 years ago, reflect stuff that you experience, including stuff in your social experience. So now we gradually came to have the notion of social networks, and here I get a little autobiographical. I apologize. My father, who was a psychiatrist most of his career, was also a social scientist. In the 1930s, he developed a field he called sociometrics, and he started to make these graphics of groups based on who chose whom for various things. So this is what he called a sociogram that he published in the early 1930s of an 8th grade class. Now the boys are represented in triangles on the left and the girls are in circles on the right in those sexist days. I'm not sure what triangles and circles mean, but that's the way they did it. And what's interesting about this is, of course, that there's only one, as you might say, ambassadorial relationship from the boys to the girls. This is the way it was in my 8th grade. I think today 8th grade maybe has changed a little bit, but it depends on what the criterion of selection is. That's very important. And then there's this isolated dyad up here on the right. Now, in those days, that was of interest to teachers who were worried about classroom behavior. And some of you know that by the 1950s, almost every school system had to have a sociometrist until about the late 1950s, in fact. The next big advance in that area was somebody who my father knew well, Kurt Lewin, who broke down the nature-nurture debate with this famous formula that behavior is a function of the person in their environment. And he was very interested particularly in social fields. And he added some really neat computation to the idea of sociometrics. And then social network analysis in sociology, especially by the late 1970s among demographers, very important area. Independently, it turns out, social network analysis through social media comes up in the early 1990s with browsers, when people realize that in the World Wide Web, these browsers start actually showing people who's linked to whom and who's looking at what. And then we have the emergence, of course, of social media. And as far as I can tell, the computer scientists, I'm working on this now, part of a book I'm writing, the computer scientists independently came up with social network analysis, while the sociologists have been doing this for decades. Of course, part of what this has meant for us is that since we host by far most of the web sites in the world, and because by the early 90s analog had turned digital, but our laws and our regulations hadn't moved along with that, we now are faced with this little problem of how much we're entitled to peek into your chats and emails and digitized telephone contacts. Here we are with a lot of interesting problems because we're really rushing to catch up with the networks that tell us, in my view, a whole lot more about you than fMRI can tell us about you. Your social networks tell us a lot more about you. If you don't believe that, call your credit card company and ask them where you've been for the last couple of days. So now we have organizations like this, and we have, of course, all the social media. We have this pressure. This is part of a longer graphic on the right, these pressures about how much government can, under the current rules, insist that social media organizations tell them about where you've been, what you've been doing on the web. And this is a little image of the NSA's new million square foot plus building that they're constructing in Utah that's going to be collecting virtually all the data that comes through, all the digital information that comes through this country, which is about everything in the world comes through this country. Now, take it back a little bit to the brain. There's this new field called social neuroscience, which is about how biological systems implement social processes and behavior. Just a couple of things that I take as examples of what's going on in social neuroscience, which perhaps could have been called neurosocial science. A few people actually call it neurosocial science, but generally it's called social neuroscience. So one example is the different parts of the brain light up under different circumstances when you're in social situations. We all know about oxytocin. Dunbar's number, I think, is very interesting. That seems to be the number of human beings with whom you can sustain a relationship. About 150, it seems. Right? Beyond that, it seems we start forgetting who we thought we knew. We start forgetting our acquaintances. Apparently, Bill Clinton can do a hell of a lot better than 150, but 150 challenges me. So we're back to our networks. Whoever brings these two networks together is going to be doing really something, the social network and the neural network. And they are, of course, in a way already together. Right? I believe the self and the mind are not just in my head. Now, in a way, we're already doing that. We're doing that with biometrics, for example. We're doing it with all new ways of registering the face, registering what's going on in fingerprints. We're kind of bringing together the neural network and the social network already. And, of course, now we have Google Glass. I don't really care if Paul's 400 feet away in the bookstore, but I do care if Paul comes up to me and says, "Hey, Professor Morena, how are you?" And I have the foggiest idea who this guy is. I would be very happy if my Google Glass immediately does the biometrics and reminds me, in your bioethics class 3 years ago, third seat, second row on the right. That would really help me a lot in social situations. And those of you who are fans of Battlestar Galactica might remember in Caprica, to get into V-World, you also had glasses that looked to me suspiciously like Google Glass. You might also know that 2 weeks ago, DARPA announced this new Boston Dynamics project, Atlas. This is Atlas on the left. Atlas is the next generation of Petman. Atlas's goal is to help warfighters carry really heavy things around, as I understand it. Nonetheless, as a Battlestar Galactica fan, the new series, not the one from 1980, I wouldn't turn my back on Atlas, especially if Atlas gets really smart. And I think Atlas will get really smart, particularly as we learn more and more about the brain and how to write better and better software that allows artificial intelligence-operated devices to be autonomous because they understand something that they don't yet understand, namely, they have judgment. So I just hope that I've illuminated some new dark corners in the last few minutes. The good news is that almost none of this is in my book, which, as a professor, gives me a reason to write yet another edition of Mind Wars. And I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for all the panelists. I will say that we have a microphone set up, and I want to start encouraging audience participation in questions. But if you do have a question, please use the microphone. If for no other reason than this is being recorded, and it's difficult to pick up the questions if you're not staying in the microphone. And so, to get things started, while people are considering. I noticed this whole group this is sort of a church thing or something like that. The first 3 rows are very sparsely, and I'm not going to make you move up, But I do think that people do need to participate a little bit in the questions. But anyway, I'm going to get things rolling with my own question exercise, my moderator's prerogative. And let me just, so, as I was listening, if I could kind of break this down into one or two word sort of summaries, and I hate to do this to you guys, but I just sort of, the themes that I heard Jim really talk about having a pragmatic approach to things as part of his 6 Ps. He had other stuff to say, but I think the thing I heard loud and clear is that we have imperatives to do work, and we need to be pragmatic about the way and balanced. Bill, going on that issue of balance, the word that I heard many times out of his mouth was the word justice, that we need to be just in our causes, we need to be just in the way we go about things, and that the moral imperative of justice was paramount. Andrew talked about enhancements and a world of enhancements and the fact that we're already in the middle of that it's not like something in the future, it's something that's ongoing now. I made a reference to caffeine, which is probably the #1 performance-enhancing drug used by the military, but this issue of enhancements is looming large, particularly as we go down the road, and we undoubtedly, with new science, we'll find targets to be able to improve, enhance human behavior, call it what you will, improve, optimize, but in any case. And then he brought up the issue of enhancement and choice, and then, of course, Jonathan emphasized that things like dignity and privacy. And so the question I'm going to talk about what I think is the elephant in the room, and I'll ask Jonathan to sort of kick off the discussion, and that is, this country was founded on certain principles, not the least of which was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all issues of privacy and other stuff aside, the ability of people to remain independent actors, not tyrannized by their government, not tyrannized by, no tyranny exerted against them by an external source. How do we, in a world where we're looking at things like improving our ability to understand the brain more, and how that might give strategic advantages to our government and our military, what are the practical ways in which we can protect the ideas of liberty, personal and otherwise?
Oh, that's easy. Excuse me, I think I have to go.
Just an easy question thrown your way.
I'm not a lawyer, but I think we have some accountability and transparency problems. It's been said by people who know a lot more about this than I do that the FISA court, for example, is not a real court. They don't meet on bank, and I'm not persuaded that the members of Congress have been fully apprised in the past, especially in a previous administration, about what was going on with some of these programs. So we probably do have a system, but we have to implement it better. Mm-hmm. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty includes privacy. It's said that by some historians of the Scots-Irish that they populated places like West Virginia and the southern United States because they wanted to get away from London. And I think there's probably some truth to that. It's much harder to get away from the revenuers than it used to be. So we do have that strong tradition of wanting to be left alone in this country. It's one of the reasons that the West is so popular, because you can go out west, and in theory, at least, you can be left alone. On the other hand, we also have a strong sense of the need to secure our friends, our family, and our possessions. Those are interesting tensions in this country. I'd add a third that makes the world look a little askance at us sometimes, which is we do have, I think, and having spoken to people who do national security stuff in other parts of the world, we do have a special interest in gadgets. And I think we in much of the rest of the world, particularly in other military establishments, we have a tendency to overestimate the utility of gadgets and underestimate the importance of lower tech ways of addressing problems. I hear this from general officers now and then. few days ago, I had the opportunity to talk to a fellow who is 90, I won't mention his name, but he retired as a major general. He was in the OSS, and he had this complaint. He said, now we think we can solve every problem with a computer program. So we've got the gadgets, especially the gadgets that can, keep track of us and maybe look inside of us, look inside our heads. We've got this concern about protecting our liberty, the nation. But we also like to get away from it all, where it all includes the people who have authority in Washington. So we have these, I'm not giving you an answer, I'm just saying, I think this is an analysis, not an answer. We have these conflicting goals, and I think we're seeing the tensions play out in the current debate with respect to NSA.
So Jim, can I sort of ask you the same question? I mean, I guess from a pragmatic approach, what are the practical ways that we might balance our security with issues like maintaining our personal liberties?
Sure, Jonathan raises a wonderful point, and clearly he and I are singing off the same sheet of music, and I'd like to think in ways that are harmonious, not necessarily the same notes. Whenever you hear the idea of national security, intelligence, and defense, one always tends to gravitate towards military operations that tend to be externalized. But let me sort of reorient the audience, and certainly even our viewers at home, as to one of the other areas where neuroscience and neurotechnology has been at least leveraged as a viable possibility to do just the type of things we're talking about here, which is protection of the polis. So let me just put some words out. Columbine, Oslo, Aurora, Colorado, Newtown. We see these things, and almost routinely across the board, certainly folks like me and obviously Phil and those of us who actually do neuroscience, the phone literally rings off the hook with calls from people who say, why don't you do something? Couldn't you predict this? Couldn't you do something? Those calls are not only from certain members of the public, but they're also from certain individuals who deal with policy and deal with politics. And the important issue here is that it becomes very, very difficult to engage the balancing act of privacy and protection. And it's something that I think we need to be dedicated to, because increasingly it's not just a question of whether or not you can scan brains and read minds. I agree. I mean, people aren't going to be going through fMRI machines. And certain claims that have been leveraged by various corporations as to be able to engage this type of technology as pure lie detection, well, difficult. But, as I'm sure as all these panel members will tell you, and as many of you know far better than even I, the idea to leverage neuroscience convergently to be able to develop what's called nodograms that based upon genomics, genetics, proteomics, certain anatomical features that then link very strongly to social behavior, social activity, and other forms of prediction that essentially divest neuroscience from the lab and put it squarely back into the realm of dealing with the polis, are in fact fairly viable as measures of, at very, very least, probabilistic prediction. The question then becomes, well, what do you do with that? I mean, obviously we may be able to have sufficient enough science to be able to back up certain claims that, yes, we can do certain things that are probabilistically inferential, but then what should we do? And this really is, I think, the goal of neuroethics, is to parse out of all the things we can do, and certainly all the things we can't, the pragmatic stance is to parse those things out, and not in a way that is part of any false hubris, but to do so realistically, number one. And then also recognize that it's very, very difficult to parse out some of the false claims that are being made. Indeed, the neuroscience types, I'd be the first to tell you, there's a lot of stuff we can't do. But are we smart enough to know we can't do that? Are we smart enough not to use these things in those ways? And also smart enough to use them in ways that are appropriate? I think that's the task at hand. The framework that I put up on the board, that roadmap, really attempts to get at that. I mean, it really gets to the issues that Bill was talking about in terms of, well, how do we use these things in a way that are just under particular silos of pre-justification and social sanctity, what our group has referred to as enablement versus enhancement. What do you do when you take the enablements away, and who's going to be responsible for that? And then if, in fact, you develop certain technologies with these heuristics and you say, well, this is the way we can go forward, and that develops new theoretical grounds for further technologies, do you go down that road? You go, uh-oh, no, this now becomes an avenue we shouldn't pursue, but then how do you enforce that globally when, in fact, free and open publications such as online access journals and rapid dissemination for open access becomes the norm in the 21st century? I don't have the answers, certainly, but I think it's important to define the question space with regard to balancing privacy and protection with regard to certain obligations of a variety of different groups, those of us who are neuroethicists and neuroscientists, and those who inform and do policy.
So I see some people at the microphone, so let's, please, by all means, let's have some questions.
Thanks. A great panel discussion from all of you. And I'd like to pose a question that Jonathan hinted at the beginning, which is that there are a lot of things that people talk about that aren't going to happen in the near term and not even the medium term. I mean, Jim also made such comments. There is a story, which may be apocryphal, that a police department once hooked up a guy to a, quote, lie detector. It turned out to be a metal spaghetti colander with some wires going into it, and went into a Xerox machine. And the Xerox machine on the inside had a statement that said, he's lying on it. And every time the suspect gave an answer that they didn't like, they pressed the machine and said, it comes out, he's lying. And eventually, he confessed, okay? The thing that I'm having watched the development of technology a lot, and overinflated claims of how fast things are coming along and so on. I'm not worried so much about the things that I agree are not going to happen, but the things that are not going to happen that people are claiming are going to happen. And you know, you've all seen policymakers grab onto anything that has the slightest chance it might possibly, maybe in some future work, and say it's working now, okay, and use that and hype money and hype programs and so on. How do you deal with that kind of environment? As you know, what are the ethics of dealing with that kind of environment?
Let me respond first, but only as sort of a prompt to my other panel members, because it's actually something we've all discussed. What I tried to do is I tried to summarize a paradigmatic approach when I put the history thing up there, which speaks exactly to your point. One of the things I think it becomes very important to do is to revest the term technology as to what it means. It's techne logos. So it's a rational accounting of not only how we use, develop, and intend tools, but also how we, in fact, do that, we as the human users and the developers. And I think one of the things that's very important to do is to avoid what we refer to as Icarus folly, of false hubris, twofold. Number one, false hubris as to what the tools can do, and false hubris of what we're capable of doing with the information and the tools itself. I think the thing that scares me most is not what neuroscience can and can't do, but what we think we're able to do with it, and then where we spool off on that. So in providing the paradigmatic approach that I offer to this audience for your consideration, I think historicity and implications of science and technology are critical. What have we done in the past, and what are the tripping hazards, to utilize James Olds' terms? If, in fact, if we get to that point, then we have to really take a very active stance of ombudsmanship. And what I meant by that was just what you're suggesting here, an honest and pragmatic appraisal of the realistic capabilities and limitations of the science and technology at hand, and the inherent tendencies for two things. Number one, false mechanistic or ampliative claims about what we're able to do with it. And number two, a strong technological imperative to use what we have in ways that it was intended to be used for. That then creates that responsible way to then be yeomanry with regard to how we then meter what we do with those particular problems. A major step is sifting out the chaff, science fiction, from the wheat, science fact, and doing that appropriately. But it becomes very difficult to do that on levels outside of the academic or scientific silo because of the very strong pulling force that these things have economically, certainly I think socially in some cases, and very often politically. And I think it creates fabric for discourse that needs to be realistically grounded.
I think that was a scene in Wired, by the way. There was something very much like that was done in Wired to intimidate this kid who had been brought in. So I actually think there is there's a possible historical analogy here. The danger is not only that some of this stuff can be overestimated by policymakers. For example, you know, a 2 or 3 in 100 false positive rate for some cool device at an airport security check would be unacceptable. I think this is sort of what I'm taking from what Jim had to say. You know, you can imagine at Dulles if 200 or 300 out of every 100 people that went through were thought to have some kind of violent ideation based on some cool technology, and then they get pulled aside into a room. Boy, TSA is going to be even bigger than it is now. But I was put in mind of this actually when Andrew was talking about cortisol levels and stress. During the Second World War, the OSS tried to figure out, first of all, who was not crazy, who wanted to get into the OSS, because a lot of crazy people did. And secondly, who of those who did qualify psychologically would be able to respond in an adequate way to a highly stressful situation. So they developed, I've been writing about this, so they developed what were called situation tests. The fellow who was in charge of situation tests was a Harvard psychologist named Henry Murray. He was the chief psychologist for the OSS, and Murray said something wonderful a few years later, reflecting on his role during the war doing social psychology for the OSS. He said, the government treats social science the way a drunk treats a lamppost, for support rather than light. There was such a, I think, disappointment about the adequacy of those social psychological personality assessments during the war that gradually the national security establishment pulled away from them. So the result was that by the Vietnam War, you had huge interpersonal problems, resulting in things like fragging, for example, attacks on officers, within pretty small units, combat units. And there were no social assessments being done of what was going on in that unit because there'd been such disappointment before. We could be, looking at a similar situation going forward with the neuroscience. We're all excited about the neuroscience, but if it doesn't pan out in 10 or 20 years or less, then will there be a kind of pulling back, which would be very unfortunate.
Our next question.
Yes, I'd like to get to a point that the very first speaker, the introductory speaker, spoke of, and it's about conflicts between the public and the scientific community. Mm-hmm. It seems to be an increasingly recent phenomenon, and I'm going to throw something out there at the speakers to see whether they agree with it or not. The Cold War forced the American people to accept science for fear of falling behind the Soviet Union. Once over, it's possible that suppressed 19th century thinking sort of reemerge, especially things such as doubts about evolution. Is it possible that the public is galvanized to put its full faith in science by fear in the political realm, primarily?
Bill, do you have any comments?
Yeah, no, the first two questions are both great questions. And so let me actually turn to the first, and then I'll address yours, sir. I think your point's very well taken, and I actually think it's tightly connected to your introductory question too, Chris. So as we look for a balance between security and liberty, there are, of course, better and worse answers, and striving to find that balance. And I think the emphasis here should be on procedural issues. Whatever balance we jointly as a polity decide upon needs to be achieved in a transparent and democratic fashion. Because guess what? It's only by being transparent and democratic in a rich sense that the benefits of education can come to the forefront, right? So a progressive educator like John Dewey would say, you want to find the right balance between these two things? Have an educated polity. And if you have an educated polity, they will make a better decision rather than a worse decision about how you balance security and liberty. And they will also be able to overcome some of the hyperbole affiliated with the salesmanship that comes with being a researcher in any field, which I think can also be a kind of a good check on ensuring that you don't buy off on results that are not as much as they're advertised. So that also then I think connects to your question. Is the public galvanized by their faith in science in a way that's different now than 100 years ago?
More than fear, yeah. The more they're afraid, the more they're likely to push their faith in science. Afraid in such a way that they won't question science so much.
Yes. Yeah, I guess I'm open-minded in that front because I see the arguments cutting both ways. So on the one hand, some people I think probably have a not as nuanced conception of what the scientific enterprise itself is about, right? And so the sociologists of science can help us understand how the scientific enterprise helps us achieve jump over certain epistemic hurdles, but can also disabuse us of myths we have about the certainty of science in a Kuhnian fashion. So that's useful, right, to help disabuse us about a misconception about what science is and does. But the flip side of it is that I think there are also lots of precautionary tales about taking science too seriously, if you will, or pushing science to the ethical brink. Multiple speakers here on the panel mentioned Orwell, 1948, 1984. We didn't talk about Shelley and Frankenstein. I mentioned a couple of pieces of popular literature, so A Clockwork Orange, THX 1138, George Lucas's first foray into dystopia. Right? I think those also inform our notions of science. So I'm open-minded about whether or not people would turn to science, if you will, because of those preconceived notions. On the one hand, we need to be disabused of false beliefs about the nature of the scientific enterprise. On the other hand, there are lots of precautionary tales that tell us about science run amok.
There's also one quick thing,
Yeah.
which is that I think during the Cold War, people were much more, also put a lot more faith in science because they simply didn't understand atomic energy, rocket science. But of course, every Yahoo thinks, well, evolution's just a theory, so they understand what they actually do.
So I think here we can say not only will fear play a role, and it always has played a role, but if you look at the way they sold the atomic program, it was not only fear, but it was also opportunity, right? So Eisenhower tried to sell it as atoms for peace. I certainly don't think that was the majority of it, and I don't think that was the majority of what they thought would come out of it, but it did play a big role. I think in neuroscience, it'll play a much bigger role. I think the opportunity side is drawing individuals today outside the government towards what people either promise or what may actually deliver. So I think this question of opportunity then, and one person getting an advantage over their neighbor, will be just as important potentially as one country getting an advantage over another country. And this sort of brings us then back to the first question, which is how do we deal with this challenge of really regulating what governments either claim they can do or will do? And I think you have to take two approaches there because of this opportunity factor, which is always there. And from the defense standpoint, it's always in the mind of, well, if we could do this, we would have these wonderful capabilities. And I think the key there is, there's a lot of discussion about educating the scientific community. But as with, educating in every respect, we need to educate the leaders because the application of any tool will be much greater if the leadership buys in, and the application of it will be much more restrained if the leadership understands needs for restraint. So I think there's sort of a bottom-up and top-down approach that we always have to remember because, frankly, in every bureaucracy, there are dark corners, especially ones where secrecy plays a necessary place.
Please.
Let's not forget about money. There was a lot of money to be made with the bomb. Universities prospered. Physicists and engineers prospered. Right? Something like that is going on right now with neuroscience and neurotechnology. Investors hope that there's going to be, there's new value, there's new wealth potentially in these technologies. There's certainly more potential value, people think, in gadgets than there is in doing a social science survey, although that was a source of wealth in the 40s and 50s and 60s, not as much anymore. So let's appreciate that part of what is driving the enthusiasm is that there's potentially gold in those hills. And that was as true during the Cold War with the buildup of the relationship between government and academia as it is now with respect to neuroscience.
Yeah, let me speak to that also if I could. The historicity piece, I think, really has to lead. I agree with that 100%. It's something I'm really committed to. Because I think in looking at the historicity not only of science and technology, but how those things have been uptaken, used, or potentially even misused by the polis, by the body politic, I think it's very, very important to say, all right, now where are we now in the Socratic sense? Where have we come from and where are you going? The question Socrates poses of Phaedrus. I think it's perfectly applicable in the same sense. To sort of keep the Socratic analogy going is something I'll do a little bit later on in this afternoon's pattern of behavior, talking about learning preceding change and how education is important to that. And that speaks back to Bill's point and certainly over to Andrew's point as well. A couple of things I think are really important to figure out here. The exact same set of technologies that we're talking about that have great potential benefit can also incur tremendous burden, if not risk and harm. So the idea we want to look at is one that's been really promulgated since antiquity. We have the face of Janus. Yes, all these things can illuminate the universe and make them bright and shiny and warm and provide us with all the things we need to sort of be nurtured and flourish and live. But the exact same entity, the exact same things, also can bespeak a whole host of our dystopian anxieties and frank fears. The question then becomes, well, how educated are we about what the science can and cannot do, and what we've done and not done with science in the past, whether it's grand challenges with regard to looking at those predicaments of the human condition that impose suffering, pain, sadness, etc., or, in fact, we're actually looking at how science can, in fact, be leveraged for a broader agenda. One of those is certainly going to be economic. Even if we move away from the idea of what I would call bombs and bullets weaponization of neuroscience, one of the things that I hope that you got from the talk that all of us put out here is that there's great economic leveraging with what neuroscience and technologies will be able to then afford. And this is not just going to be among Western powers. This is global, based upon a number of different factors. Clearly then what you're seeing is that the economic stage as a pulling force is able to then engage neuroscience and neurotechnology in what the French postmodern philosopher referred to as biopower, biopolitics. And we have to look at that as well under the same sort of rubric or agenda of what does then international relations and security mean when perhaps one of the currencies then becomes science and technology that affects important definitions that have been philosophically bantered around since human history, really. What is the nature of the self, the mind, free will, etc.? Well, these are viable sites of intervention, and then what do we do with that in terms of flourishing human limits, haves and have-nots? So the idea of national security and defense plays a role here also in terms of how are these things leveraged within economic and political markets by nation states, actors, and corporations that'll increasingly be, I think, the players in this new sort of neuroculture, if you would.
So we have an online question from Dennis Larive for Dr. Casebeer. What ethical framework do we reference when we consider a possible alteration of central behavioral, for example, emotional circuits in infantrymen? How do we keep in mind the personal identity of the affected individual?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. We are fortunate, at least when we're talking about U.S. infantrymen, to have an all-volunteer force. So the individuals who go through the training procedures that are required to earn that, military operations specialty, consent to that process, and have at least some understanding of the judicial limits upon that consent and kind of the outer boundaries of what can and cannot be done to them during training in order to help them earn that badge. So in much the same way that when you are on the rifle range and you're learning to hold a rifle, and that oftentimes involves an instructor physically positioning you so that you can know how to hold the rifle, that's a touching, right? That in other cases where consent isn't involved would constitute an assault, right? Legally. So in the same way that we have procedures in place to help us understand what it means to be involved in an all-volunteer force as opposed to a draftee force, and in the same way that we educate people about the limits of consent so that they can know when the consent does not serve a training end and presses upon the liminal outer limits of respect for their dignity as a person, and whose very respect allowed us to train them, to begin with. Those same kind of standards, I would argue, should be applied to the neurosciences. So that probably means that we will need to think more deeply about what constitutes core aspects of people's behavior and dispositions, to which attach issues of agency that make the very act of consent possible. And those are going to be a hard core beyond which you shouldn't penetrate, because to do so would be to undermine the very conditions that allowed them to morally give consent in the first place. I don't know where that hardcore boundary is set. That's something that we have to triangulate on as a polity using these Kantian-style thoughts, I would argue.
It is really interesting that, and maybe it's a testimony to a little bit of moral progress, that we're even worried about that. Imagine a commander 100 years ago, if somebody said, hey, General, you're changing the personality of these guys when you're training them and taking them to combat. Yeah, that's the whole idea. So are we now presupposing that there is some core notion of personality that is inviolable? That's a new one. That's a new idea.
In fact, I think you see that today. If you look at the recruiting videos, it's often the theme is, I left a child and came home a man or a woman. So I think it plays today. And, to think about how we would ever apply something like that, I agree with Bill's point that there will have to be a consent approach. Forcing these things on people is really generally, I think, against the American way of life and our sort of constitutional approach that underlies hopefully everything we do. And that will probably force us to, if we do offer this choice to people, which we may not do because of the inherent coercion in a military environment, will require certain anonymity of decisions. And so what that will require then is not only that you can be anonymous about whether or not you chose or didn't choose, you'll probably then have to give that person an opportunity to compete for whatever slot they want, irregardless of whether they chose to or to not, because otherwise there is tremendous coercive power of saying, that's fine, you can choose not to do this, but you'll never be a special operations, a qualified military personnel. So I think, if anything we've talked about today, it's that this is an interlinked web of ethical and practical considerations. And if we don't consider the practical effects, we will miss the mark on the ethical and vice versa, I think.
And just in order to get this last question in, because we only have 3 minutes, and I should say that, all the panelists and stuff, we're participating today, and myself, and I'm sure all the other panelists would be glad to answer any questions later, but I do want to get to the last question before.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about your thoughts of the weaponization of medical neurotechnology, not by responsible groups like governments, but by rogue actors. And governments are directly engaged against groups like Al-Qaeda, but biotechnology companies and universities are not, engaged versus these actors. But the technologies that they develop may become tools in the hands of these rogue actors. So what responsibility do they have to ensure that what they're working on doesn't become weaponized by some sort of rogue person? And is there a culpability? Should there be a culpability? And what is the responsibilities that they have? Thank you.
I'll take it quickly and then pass it off. Interestingly, that was the exact focus of a panel and day-long discussion we had here at AAAS under the leadership of Dr. Kavita Berger, who was really interested in the whole idea of dual-use neuroscience and neurotechnology. It's an issue. I mean, obviously, neuroscience, neurotechnology exists in the public domain as publishable and disseminable information that can be uptaken by a variety of groups. Simply even taking something that I can design that is going to be beneficial to Group X, withholding that in such a way from Group Y, then exerts the same type of power that we talked about earlier. So the question is whether or not there's sufficient enough information to then be uptaken and bastardized by various individuals who can then weaponize that outside the auspices of what may be adequate surveillance. There's the key. How do we then survey the field? How do we then put into place particular surety measures that may in fact be viable? Wendy Schoenfeld, for example, at Sandia National Laboratories, together with my colleague Chris Forsyth, is trying to develop an actual paradigmatic approach for surety protocols in neuroscience to do just the type of thing that you're talking about. Difficult to do because neuro, unlike something like nuke, is not something, well, if I go to the store and ask for my hardware guy, can I get some depleted uranium or plutonium, they're going to go, oh, yeah, sure, I'll be happy to give it to you. But I can order a whole bunch of stuff from the Sigma catalog. Moreover, if I'm doing so with a funding resource, I might be able to do it in my basement. So it certainly is an ethical challenge that speaks back to the earlier point that both John and Andrew just made in terms of understanding the practicality of what can be done and what can't, and then basing particular ethical and even policy and laws onto how that may in fact need to be surveilled, guided, governed, etc.
So I should apologize because I actually have to leave, and I will not be around the rest of the day. I have to run to give a talk in New York. But the one problem is that the first mover has to set the rules and explain how they are following the rules. Otherwise, you don't have any leverage with the other state actors, let alone non-state actors. And we haven't done that very well. So that's I think in cyber and in drone and all these related technologies, and we haven't really said what the rules are and how we are following the rules when we start to use this stuff. And we've had this experience, long experience with Nuke. It's the same thing. It does strike me that even when I was talking about the soft neuroscience, the soft social science of social networking earlier, radical organizations learned about social network theory in the 60s and used it quite well. American radical organizations couldn't do much except blow themselves up, but other radical organizations like the Baader-Meinhof gang and so forth understood that how you would make sure that only certain people had links to certain other people in the network. And so they protected themselves. So there's almost no way to stop stuff from being used. The problem is to, at least you can try to set out the standards in the beginning and establish some legal and moral leverage.
I would jump in and say that I'm hard-pressed to find one piece of science or technological development that I'm aware of that isn't dual use.
Yeah.
And so as a result, we have to accept this fact if we want some of the opportunities presented by it. And so I'll answer it a bit from the national security point of view, which is how do we handle people who might use things against us that we think are unethical? And I'll say there I have two answers. One, we need to think about what those might be, because if we put our heads in the sand, DARPA's mission is to prevent us from being surprised and to surprise others. So we need to make sure we're not surprised. I call that pardon me, intellectual experimentation. Even if we're not going to do it, let's think about what might happen, and then let's choose what not to respond to in kind. And let's do it consciously and with ethical guidance. And for those things where we won't respond in kind, or where responding in kind isn't helpful, which is often the case, then let's identify asymmetric responses. We've almost defined asymmetric responses as what other people do to us, but it's really just using a different approach to solve a problem. So we need to think asymmetrically in this case so that we continue to operate ethically under our own rules and guidance that are derived from valid ethics and moral principles, so that we can develop ethical countermeasures and not say we have to use it because they have, which is, I think, not a valid ethical approach.
So that'll be the last word of this session. I would be remiss if I didn't finally. I want to thank all the AAAS fellows, but particularly Heather Dean, who has helped herd the cats on this group and helped me tremendously as the moderator. And we'll have the breakout sessions now, the working lunch and breakout 1 in the neuroethics of defense. And did you want any other?
Thank you so much. Just a little bit of logistics. Outside, lunch is ready. We ask that you grab your lunch, and as you leave, there are fellows that are ready to hand you a slip of paper that will tell you which breakout room you'll go to. Please, once you have your lunch, go to that room. We hope that you very much enjoy the discussion there. We ask that each group find someone who is willing to come back and present to us after lunch to let us know, and let those that are following along online know what was discussed in each of those breakout groups. And also, one last note, we have a couple of books for sale just outside of this room, including Jonathan Moreno's Mind Wars and a book Jim Giordano brought. Those are available for cash sale, so please check those out on your way out to lunch. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of our day.